because of security measures, but fortunately everything is okay. And first of all, I like to thank you all at UNPO for organizing this event. I had very little work, you did it. And so you made it possible. Yeah. And I'm very curious about the results which will come. I have studied a little bit the situation, but I am sure today I will learn much more. I'm hopeful that this event will also connect different groups working in this field, political fields, environmentalists, and so on. And I'm very worried in particular about the situation of the local communities around the lake, which are sometimes in a very bad situation. We need this to make a thing of international affairs, because as yet the Iranian government did not react to our request, which in a way is clear because our contacts have not been established long time ago. But still, I think only international pressure can change here something, and we will try to start it. Well, as you know, I'm a nuclear scientist, so I started to be interested in this problem because of the radioactivity. But the radioactivity is not the only problem. It's simply that this sand poisons the fields, and agriculture is more and more difficult.
Iran, mainly Azeris and Kurds, are raising their voices. They are calling to have a bigger say in the management of the lake in order to improve the livelihoods of the surrounding inhabitants, of their own communities. The second piece of good news is that there are members of the European Parliament who are listening and who are acting. For example, a member of European Parliament, Klaus Buchner, and Mark Demesmaeker submitted a parliamentary question which requests the European Commission to adopt an official stance on Lake Urmia and to outline the concrete measures that will be taken to ameliorate the situation. And the third piece of good news is that President Rouhani also seems to be listening. I mean, this is evidenced by the fact that he has tailored his political campaign to reflect what the people are demanding to save Lake Urmia. And this is why so many journalists seem to be optimistic about Iran's plans. But the hard part, of course, is turning these promises into concrete, immediate, pragmatic, and well-researched action. And this is where Iran seems to be stuck, or rather deliberately unwilling to move forward. And there is no time for inaction. Lake Urmia is at the tipping point of sudden death. I will now give the floor to the speakers for today's conference, experts and activists alike, who will shed light on the causes and consequences of Lake Urmia's deterioration, and the role that the EU and other international actors can play in saving the lake, its body of water, its wildlife, and its surrounding population from complete disaster in an already politically volatile and vulnerable region. On behalf of UNPO, I thank you all for coming, and I wish you a fruitful debate.
Thank you very much, Ms. Petkovic. I am Fernando Burgess, also from UNPO. I will be moderating this conference. We will run a unique panel. I would like to thank all of you for being here, but a special thanks to our speakers. We will start with Mr. Steven Blockmans. He's a senior research fellow and head of the EU Foreign Policy at the Center for European Policy Studies. He will speak about the relations between EU and Iran before and after the nuclear deal. Mr. Blockmans, due to other commitments, he will have to leave a bit earlier, but thank you very much for being here. We will follow with Ms. Esther Pozovera. She is the coordinator for European neighborhood countries and Mediterranean issues at the DG for Environment. She will look at the role of the EU in international environment policy, focusing on the Central Asia and the neighboring countries. Following we'll have Dr. Stefan Mischke from University of Iceland. I would like to say special thanks to Dr. Mischke because he came from Iceland especially to be here. Thank you very much for your efforts. Following, we will have Ms. Aida Karimli. She's the spokesperson of the Southern Azerbaijani Alliance. Thank you very much. And Mr. Amir Mardani, founder and spokesperson of the South Azerbaijani Student Movement. We will start now with the first speaker, Mr. Steven Blockmans, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation, of course, to speak at this conference. I'm by no means an environmental expert and know very little about Lake Urmia, but you've specifically invited me to sketch the wider context in which EU-Iran relations operate, where they've come from and where they may go over time. So I'll stick to that brief, if you allow me, and be rather telegraphic, if you want, on the history of relations between the EU and Iran. We all know much about it, and it's maybe good to have a few things back in order, but I would like to focus a little bit more on where we're headed with the EU and Iran. It's obvious to say that there exists a long history of bilateral relations between EU member states and Iran in several fields: trade, energy, tourism. But as far as the EU is concerned, that means above and beyond the member states, those relations are much younger. It was really only in the mid-1990s that real efforts were being made in order to structure and enhance the bilateral relationship in the commercial and the political field. As far as commerce is concerned, there were in fact quite hopeful developments at the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s, when the Council of Ministers of the EU adopted a mandate for the negotiations on what was called the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, a TCA, and also a political dialogue agreement with Iran in 2001. The negotiations started in both spheres in 2002, but they were broken off in August of 2005 due to revelations of Iran's clandestine nuclear activities and its refusal to cooperate with the IAEA, the International Agency in Vienna. And that multilateralized also, I think, the relationship between the EU and Iran, and put it under the chapeau primarily of the UN Security Council, which adopted a whole raft of resolutions backing up the IAEA's Board of Governors findings of non-compliance of Iran with its safeguards obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. As far as trade is concerned still, it has since then been subject to a general EU import regime, since Iran is not a member of the WTO. Iran has, of course, submitted its membership application, but since there has not been any agreement within the WTO, the start of an accession process has never happened. And in fact, subject to the conditions which are set out in the EU's sanctions regime, EU trade with Iran is therefore in principle legal, but
in our relationship, when we have a relationship with a country, the relationship is basically at bilateral level, at regional level, and what we call cross-border cooperation programs. Obviously, for the European Union, the neighborhood countries is one of our big priorities in general, and you know that we are now negotiating, or it's going to be published in a few days, the European Neighborhood Policy Review with the new communication of what are going to be the areas of cooperation. But in general, bilateral cooperation is very important with our partners, and I'm going to focus more on the Eastern Partnership since it's close to Iran, even if it's basically Turkey is part of what we call the enlargement countries. But if you look at Armenia or Azerbaijan, they are part of our neighborhood East. And And cooperation is based on what we call association agreements and then also action plans. And in these action plans is a negotiation that the European Union does with the country, and basically we decide in which areas we want to cooperate. Most of the, well, all of the action plans have an environmental chapter, and within environment this is a vast area, so we decide which areas are more interesting for both. So we always try to do this really in partnership, so it's not the European Union telling the other country what they have to do, is a real dialogue between both of us, because we also want to ensure ownership from the country, because if we have an agreement but the other part doesn't want to implement it, so what's the point? It's very beautiful on paper, but what we want is to change things on the ground. So these action plans sometimes take years to negotiate, but when they are negotiated, we tend to implement them, and we meet annually or biannually or twice every 2 years to see how progress is going. And there are also commitments from the European Union. For us in the bilateral relations, it's very important to the implementation of multilateral environmental agreements. And in this bilateral relationship, it's not only about the EU providing money, it's also about the EU providing technical assistance and cooperation at a technical level and peer-to-peer relationship. So that means also having experts from the European Union, and when I mean the European Union, is not people from the Commission, but from the EU member states, going to the countries and trying to help to improve things. And we also invite experts from the countries to come to the European Union and learn about the things we do. And we always try to do it in a partnership, at least for the environment, things that we can learn from each other. And these action plans that, if you wish, are operationalized also what we call single support frameworks, which is basically a document where the countries decide which 3 priorities they want the EU to invest. So this is more about the money. The action plan is a political document, but the single support framework then decides in which 3 areas we're going to be providing financial support. Environment is very prominent, especially in all the southern Mediterranean and the Middle East countries, of obvious reasons. Water is a very important aspect, but also waste management. So water and waste management is a real focus for Mediterranean countries and the Middle East. If we go to the Eastern Partnership, they are more interested in rural development. And within that, we have a lot of water management, land restoration, and also green economy. Eastern Partnership countries are really focusing in shifting towards the green economy and how we can cooperate in eco-innovation, but also greening the economy, sectors like agriculture, energy, etc. In this sense, I can tell you that for the Eastern Partnership, we've invested about, in the last programming period, about 80–90 million euros on regional programs in CDC, but when you look at the bilateral support, the amount is about 300 million euros. One important instrument we have is the Neighbourhood Instrument Facility, and we also have the same for Central
Case studies. I think the best feature to describe the present state of Lake Oromia is its water level history. And I think this is here the longest available water level history for Lake Oromia. It's covering the last 100 years. And while it shows some up and downs, climatically driven, it shows that there was a relatively low lake level period in the first part of the 20th century, a relatively high lake level period in the second part of the 20th century, with a maximum in the mid-1990s. But since that time, the lake level declined in a more or less continuous way. And what is even more important is the fact that the lake entered a new state which hadn't been seen in the last 100 years. So something in the system must have changed, that the lake did not achieve a higher level anymore since about 10 years. Another view at this disaster is looking at the aerial extent, looking at the spatial expression of the lake, and while this is best done using satellite images, which are not available for such a long period of time, but it shows in the 1970s a relatively large lake area. We can use something like a very simple water budget. So what is actually arriving in the form of water is precipitation falling directly onto the lake surface. It's precipitation
in the catchment area, creating runoff, charging groundwater, which is also flowing to the lake. And because it's a closed basin, because it has no outlet, all the water which is entering the lake is in balance with water loss due to evaporation from its surface. And this evaporation is mostly controlled by temperature. So it's a relatively simple system. It's only precipitation, temperature, and basically runoff, which is controlling its water budget. Lake Urmia, it's a specific case. It has a very flat topography, and a relatively minor drop in lake level causes a large change, a large consequence for its surface area. In comparison to a steep-walled lake basin, every water level drop is showing such large consequences. So let's have a look to these three parameters: precipitation, temperature, and runoff. This is precipitation history for two stations, one in the east, one in the west of the lake, for the last 60 years, showing that, well, there's certainly some up and down. There had been a higher frequency of drought years, these purple colors here on the right-hand side, during the last 10, 15 years, had been increased. But in general, precipitation is not changing as dramatically as would be expected looking at the lake level history. What about temperature? There's a slight increase in winter temperatures in the upper panel for the last 50 years. Spring temperatures are very slightly increasing. Summer temperatures are more or less at a constant level, and fall, autumn temperatures are slightly decreasing. So temperature is apparently not really an issue here. What about runoff? The upper right panel shows a map with dams, larger dams, which had been already existing in the years 2011 and 12 in red and orange. And the blue dots here show dams which had been under construction. Correlation, for example, here in the mid-80s, there was a dramatic increase in number of dams, but it's the large dams which are adding large irrigated farmlands to the system, and which are creating this stepwise rise in irrigated farmland. So this panel for the last 40 years shows rainfall in blue in the Lake Urmia region and runoff entering the lake from different streams, from different rivers. And for the first part of this diagram, until the mid-1990s, runoff in red is more or less following this rainfall pattern. But since the mid-1990s, a gap became larger and larger. Precipitation remained at a relatively high level here in this diagram, and runoff was dropping, and this gap was becoming larger and larger. So it's quite evident, it's quite clear that the rapidly increasing use of surface and probably also groundwaters are the main factor creating the rapid drop in Lake Urmia's lake level. Climate may have added a minor component to this change, but it's certainly not the reason. And if you had a look to this table here, it's only for 3 years of irrigated farmland in East and West Azerbaijan, and it shows that irrigated farmland irrigated farmland area was tripling within these three, or almost tripling within these 3 years between 2007 and 2009. Dryland farmland, rain-fed farmland here is more or less constant, so it's surely irrigation. So we know the lake achieved a state which hadn't been seen during the last 100 years. One could argue, well, there might be a natural cycle of 200 years. So I was trying to check whether Lake Urmia had achieved a more or less playa lake environment, a desiccated lake basin environment. And there are data here from the 70s and 80s, a Swiss-Iranian cooperation was